Have you ever considered that all seven continents used to be one single landmass? Well, that's true. This theory caused a lot of controversy, and many scientists opposed it. Take, for example, Charles Hapgood. He wrote a book that criticized and mocked this theory. Even Einstein, he didn't believe in it. He wrote a short foreword to Hapgood's book. In addition, many field works were done, and theories emerged to dismiss the theory that the Earth moves. Two geologists, Castor and Mendes, had done lots of researches and fieldwork studies on both sides of the Atlantic, and reaches to a conclusion that the rock formation on both sides they do not match. Other scientists claimed that there were land bridges that connected continents with each other, and claimed that due to these land bridges, species that were found in South America were also found in Southeast Asia, and so on. However, later researchers proved that the rock formation on both sides of the Atlantic are indeed the same. The land bridges idea was also dismissed because there isn't any evidence that supports it. 1908 was the year the idea of the Earth moves started to emerge. Frank Taylor, an American geologist, was amazed by the similarity in shape between the facing coastline of Africa and South America. He then developed the idea that continents had once slid around. He even concluded world's mountain chains were a clear result of the splitting of the continents. However, Taylor failed to provide evidence for his theory. Alfred Wegener then picked up Taylor's idea and modified it by witnessing identical species that lived in opposite sides of the world. He then suggested that the world's continents had once slid around as a single land mass, which he called Pangea. His theory was also challenged, and many scientists belittled his suggestions. Moreover, some of his assumptions could not be true, like Greenland is drifting west by about 1.6 kilometers a year, which is nonsense. It wasn't until Arthur Holmes who came up with the convincing theory. He was the first scientist who understood that radioactive warming could produce convection currents within the Earth, and this could be powerful enough to split continents. Holmes later published a book called Principles of Physical Geology that laid out a continental drift theory. This theory convinced many scientists that in the meeting of the British Association for Advancement of Science, about 50% of those scientists who were present embraced the continental drift theory. There was another problem that kept scientists searching for an answer, which was where all the sediments went. During the Second World War, Harry Hess, a mineralogist, realized that ocean floor wasn't ancient. He has also found out that the largest and widest mountain range on Earth was underwater. Moreover, in the mid-Atlantic ridge was a canyon up to 20 kilometers wide and 19,000 kilometers length. This suggested that Earth was splitting apart. Core samples then showed that the ocean floor was young at the mid-Atlantic but grew older as one moves to either sideways. After this discovery, Harry Hess realized that new ocean crusts are formed on either side of the central rift, then being pushed away from it as more new crusts come along behind. When the crust reaches the end of its journey at the boundaries with the continents, it plunks back into the Earth in a process called subduction. This illustrated that the sediments were returning to the center of the Earth and explained why the ocean floors were young. This theory by Hess was a very good one, but it was almost universally ignored. Meanwhile, two researchers were working independently on some findings. 1906, Bernard Branches, a French physicist, had discovered the Earth's magnetic field reverses itself at records fixed in rocks at their birth, especially iron ore grains. They point in the direction of the magnetic poles until the rocks cool and harden. In 1950, Patrick Blackett of London University and Ron Corn of Newcastle University studied the magnetic patterns of British rocks. They found that one day Britain has spun on its axis and moved to the north. They also found that Europe and America's magnetic patterns were similar. However, their findings were never taken into consideration. Geologists Drummond Matthews and Fred Vine, a graduate student, started relating all the theories together. In 1963, they demonstrated that the sea floor was spreading in the way Hess had proposed, and that the continents were moving too. Lawrence Morley was an unlucky Canadian geologist who had also reached the same conclusion, but he was never able to get his paper published. Morley was even told that these speculations would make an interesting talk in a cocktail party, but should never be considered scientific. In 1964, people in the field were convinced that the Earth was a mixture of interconnected segments, whose grand jostling was the reason behind the planet's behavior. The theory was no more called continental drift because it was found that the whole crust was moving, not only the continents. In 1924, Harlow Jeffreys published a textbook that disapproved of the idea of plate tectonics, and in 1970, he still insisted that this theory was impossible, and that's what he stated in the latest edition. Jeffreys' book also disagreed about convection and sea floor spreading. In 1980, Joe McPhee noted that 1/8 of American geologists still didn't believe in plate tectonics. Today we know that the Earth's surface is made up of 8 to 12 big plates and 20 or so smaller ones that all move in different directions and different speeds. The plates are dispersed under the continents, and the chaos continues to prevent the plates from fusing into a single static plate. The reality is, continents are actually moving apart in a very slow manner, which makes it negligible. Tectonic plates play an important role in our life on Earth. They're responsible for things like climate changes. Plate tectonics explained many phenomena, starting from the dynamics of Earth and how an ancient Hyperion got from France to Florida. For instance, the internal actions like earthquakes, the formation of ion chains, the carbon cycle, the location of mountains, the coming of ice ages, and even the origins of life itself. Geologists, as McPhee had noted, realized why the whole Earth suddenly made sense. The distributions of continents in earlier times are not well determined to people outside geophysics. Although textbooks confidently represent ancient land masses with names like Gondwana and Pangaea, there are sometimes conclusions that seem unrelated. George Gaylord Simpson observes in Fossils and the History of Life that ancient species of plants and animals appear in inconvenient places. Gondwana, which is believed to be a landmass that once linked all continents together, was based on the distributions of a kind of ancient tongue fern, which was found in all the right places. However, it was discovered in parts of the world that had no known connection to Gondwana. This discrepancy was and continues to be ignored. There are also features that cannot be explained by tectonics. Alfred Wegener never lived to see his ideas vindicated. When he was 50, that was in 1930. He went on an expedition on his own to check out a supply drop, but he never got back from his journey. A few days later, he was found frozen to death on the ice. He was buried in the spot and still lies there, but about a meter closer to North America than on the day he died. Einstein also didn't live long enough to see that he had followed the wrong theory. He died at Princeton in 1955, before even Charles Hapgood's continental drift theory was published. Harry Hess, who was the other believer in tectonics theory, was also at Princeton at that time, and he would spend the rest of his career there. Walter Alvarez was his student who would eventually change the world of science in a pretty different way. The tragedy of geology had only just begun, and it was young Alvarez who helped start the process. It wasn't until 1963 when Huss's ideas was proved to be right by a doctor named Matthew and Fred Vine, his student, as they finally managed to prove that the continents were in motion and that the sea crust moves towards the east or the west. And so, an important symposium, which had many important figures, was held in London to discuss the theory as it tried to reach scientific results. As a result of all these events, an article was published discussing the issue where the whole process was called plate tectonics and it was explained lengthily. However, the plate tectonics theory is no different than others, but the article was met with huge criticism, to the extent that Jeffreys said, having British scientists accepting the idea shows how the mentality of the British is deteriorated. It took many years until the idea was officially proved right, after it was discovered that the Earth's surface is broken into a number of shifting slabs or plates, which average between 50 miles in thickness. Furthermore, the theory of plate tectonics helped in demonstrating more important discoveries. For instance, in '02, Tony Dixon suggested that there may be a relation between history of rocks and that of Earth, which led to discovering more about early lives and creatures.